Thank you. Happy to be here. All right. So in the first few centuries of the Common Era, Christians were the targets of sporadic persecutions on behalf of Roman authorities. The imperial persecutions of Decius, Valerian, and Diocletian were interspersed with more localized outbreaks of violence, and Christians' refusal to pay homage to the traditional Roman gods made them convenient scapegoats whenever things went wrong. As the North African writer Tertullian famously wrote in the late 2nd century, if the Tiber rises as high as the city walls, if the Nile does not send its water up over the fields, if the heavens give no rain, if there's an earthquake, if there's famine or pestilence, straight away the cry is, away with the Christians to the lion. Relatively few Christians actually became martyrs, however. Many people, rather than die for their beliefs, made compromises of various types. During the Decian persecutions, everyone was required to receive a certificate called a libellus, seen here, to prove that they had sacrificed to the emperor. But of course, it was possible to bribe officials to give you a certificate anyway, or to simply forge a document yourself. Other people fled or simply hid to avoid detection and waited till things cooled down. The question of how to appropriately respond to these intermittent outbreaks of violence and persecution was a challenging one for bishops even. Some advocated for staying and facing punishment no matter what that punishment was, while others, like Cyprian of Carthage, for example, asserted that fleeing, like he did, was an acceptable and even itself a form of martyrdom. Ultimately, however, these Christians who were martyred became central figures in the communal memory of Christians, perhaps in part because those who were left knew that there were many options that they could have taken to avoid martyrdom, but instead they chose to pay the ultimate price to demonstrate their love and belief in God. Beginning in at least the late 2nd century, Christians kept records of the martyrs' deaths. Some of these early martyr accounts are little more than court transcripts and records of the confessions of the martyrs and the fact that they were then executed. Others, particularly into the 3rd and 4th centuries, take the shape of narratives that are increasingly complex. The martyrs are often depicted within these texts as athletes or gladiators, waging a battle not with Roman authorities, but against the devil himself. The tortures that they endured are described in sometimes uncomfortable detail, and the martyrs are praised for being able to endure such pain. In this context, death is treated not as a defeat, but a victory. These stories of these martyrs seem to have been quite popular among early Christians, and the anniversaries of some of the martyrs' deaths are celebrated yearly. As part of this recognition, the martyr narratives were read aloud in church services, and their actions may be referenced in sermons connected to scriptural passages. Christians are encouraged to hold up martyrs as examples to emulate, if not by becoming martyrs themselves, then at least by exhibiting similar attributes of modesty, patience, endurance, and courage. The Roman province of North Africa, modern-day Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, there at the bottom, had a particularly strong martyr tradition. The first Christian text that we have from the region is in fact a martyrdom text that recounts the trial and deaths of 12 Christians in the year 180 CE. North Africa is also the home of one of the most extraordinary early Christian texts, the Passion of Perpetua. The Passion of Perpetua contains a diary written by a woman named Perpetua. She's a 22-year-old wife and mother who, along with several Christian companions, is imprisoned and then executed in the year 203 CE. Not only does this provide a rare glimpse into the mindset of a martyr to be, but it is also one of only a handful of early Christian texts written by a woman. Although the text has certainly undergone some editing, it's given a narrative framework by an anonymous editor and also includes descriptions of the experiences of some of the other martyrs who were with Perpetua, we can be reasonably sure that at least some of the sentiments and experience are authentic to Perpetua herself. But for all that made Perpetua unique, the fact that she's a woman and a martyr is not something that sets her apart in and of itself. Most often, martyrs are arrested and executed in groups, and these groups are typically quite diverse in terms of gender and also social status. Though the various descriptions in martyr literature and from the inscriptions of martyrs who don't otherwise appear in literary records, it's clear that women could die for their faith just as well as men could. However, there are important differences in the way that their genders are portrayed, especially in the literature. And one way that we can see this is the different ways that male and female martyrs are described in relation to their families. Family imagery is prevalent in early Christian writings in general. Christians rhetorically created new families that made up of their fellow Christians. They called each other brother and sister. They spoke of God the Father and the church as their mother. This continues in martyr texts, as martyrs are often depicted as finding comfort and joy in sharing their martyrdom with their spiritual brothers and sisters. Earthly biological families do appear in martyr texts, but often the focus is on the way that martyrs-to-be have to reject their non-Christian families in order to achieve eternal glory through martyrdom. However, as I will demonstrate, not all martyrs need to reject their families, and not all martyrs are even depicted as having families at all. And so in this talk today, I'm first going to provide an overview of some of the family identities of male and female martyrs in the North African martyr literary tradition. This is going to show that the fact that women are more often depicted as rejecting their families than men are is a function of the fact that they are more often depicted as having families in the first place. Furthermore, even when men are depicted as having family identities, these descriptions are often far more simplistic and far less detailed than the women's family identities. Second, we're going to talk about some of the reasons for the disconnection between the way that male and female martyrs are depicted in relation to their family roles, thinking about scholarship of the ancient family in order to consider the rhetorical implications of depicting male martyrs as almost completely absent from the family while associating female martyrs so strongly with it. Why is it that men could be martyrs without families, but for women, martyrdom was almost always a family affair? And third, I'll speak a little bit about gendered punishment that women martyrs experienced. Although they are able to die like men, and although both men and women were tortured, Roman officials found it powerful to juxtapose violence with these women's perceived feminine weaknesses. So let's first turn to some examples from the martyrdom literature. Female martyrs in North African texts are described as wives, mothers, daughters, and sisters. And so I'll briefly describe the way that each of these roles appeared in different martyr literature. So the first is the role of wives. In the Passion of Perpetua, Perpetua's identity as a wife only appears in the introduction when the editor calls her honorably married. However, this is the only place in the entire text that her identity of wife is mentioned, and she herself never refers to her husband at all in any of her diary sections, and he doesn't appear even where you might expect him, for example, in the trial sections where other of her family members are there. Two later accounts of Perpetua's martyrdom, perhaps maybe dating to the 5th century, do insert her husband in the list of family members that try to get Perpetua to repent, but he doesn't have his own dialogue. He's merely speaking along with her parents and brothers, and they don't share any scenes between just husband and wife. In all cases, Perpetua's wife identity is not the focus, although having it present in the background does transmit some information about her. She's an ideal Roman woman. She fulfills her expected role by getting married. In the case of Perpetua's companion, Felicitas, she is not identified as a wife also anywhere in the original Passion of Perpetua, and this is probably and likely because her slave status meant that she could not legally marry. But just like the later Acta takes pains to include Perpetua's husband in the narrative, this same text also makes sure to tell us that Felicitas is a wife. In this case, she's no longer described as a slave, and instead her husband is even said to be a plebeian. While Perpetua doesn't speak about her husband at all, Felicitas is shown as forcefully rejecting her husband in this text, saying in response to the proconsul's question about her marital status, she says, "I have a husband whom I now hate." Here, Felicitas' husband serves as a narrative function, providing her with a way of loudly proclaiming her Christianity above all else. Her rejection of her husband confirms her rejection of the family role of wife and confirms her adherence to her Christian identity. There's one more North African text where a female martyr is explicitly described as a wife, and this is the Martyrdom of Montanus and Lucius, in which a small part of it talks about a woman named Portolosa. She's arrested alongside her Christian husband and son, who are both not given names in the text, although she is. Her husband and son are killed 3 days before her, and she receives a vision that makes up the main focus of her narrative. What's important to note here, and I'll talk about the vision in a minute, what's important to note at this point is that her identity of a wife does not need to be sidelined in this case. It doesn't need to be ignored or rejected because her husband was also a Christian, and he's already died as a martyr. So she can continue to be associated with the identity of wife. Still, like Perpetua and Felicitas, her husband does not speak within the text, and her role of wife is ultimately in name only. So we can see that the wife identity is somewhat ambiguous. It doesn't seem to have been rhetorically important with regards to martyrdom, as we'll see in some other identities to which we now turn. So the identities of wife and mother often exist simultaneously with each other, both in general in the Roman world, but also within Christian martyr texts. And so even though the same martyrs who are identified as wives are also depicted as mothers, the role of mother is far more detailed and plays a lot more significant of a role in the narratives. Perpetua's identity as a mother is foremost in her text. Her motherhood identity is intimately connected with breastfeeding. Perpetua has an infant child who she is nursing, and this is a constant image throughout the narrative that reinforces her identity as a mother and the societal expectations of this identity. For example, Perpetua's main concern when she's transferred from house arrest to the prison is for her son. When she's reunited with them as a result of bribery on behalf of the deacons, the first thing she does is nurse him, and she reports that both she and her son are comforted immediately. She says, "I was tortured with worry for my baby there, but then I nursed my baby who was faint from hunger. Then I got permission for my baby to stay with me in prison. At once I recovered my health, relieved as I was of my worry and anxiety over the child, and my prison suddenly became a palace." However, a few days later, Perpetua's father confronts her at a hearing and tries to convince her to change her mind and renounce her Christianity. He reminds Perpetua that her death might mean death for the child also. Perpetua's father begs her to think of your child, who will be gone if you are gone, who will not be able to live if you are gone. This again connects the mother identity with providing sustenance, literal sustenance. It's significant that he appeals to Perpetua's identity as mother to her son rather than simply her identity as a daughter, particularly considering the Roman father was expected to have absolute authority over his children. This perhaps speaks to the perceived power of the identity of mother and the strength of the connection between mother and child. Later, as Perpetua continues to refuse to recant, her father does not allow her to continue to have her son with her in prison. "I sent the deacon Pomponius straight away to my father to ask for the baby, but the father refused to give him over. As God willed, the baby had no further desire for the breast, nor did I suffer any inflammation, and so I was relieved of anxiety for my child and any discomfort for my breast." So Perpetua's father makes it so that her identity as a mother no longer exists, but Perpetua sees this action as being divinely ordained. This divine gift makes it possible for Perpetua to complete the transformation to martyr by no longer being a mother. She has no longer any need to focus her energy on worrying for her son. She has no physical ramifications for this, and the connection to her family is broken, and she's able to focus on God. Still, within the Passion of Perpetua, motherhood still looms large, as her fellow martyr Felicitas is largely defined by her identity as a mother-to-be. She is 8 months pregnant when she's arrested, and she agonizes over the fact that her condition might preclude her from being martyred along with the rest, as Romans did not execute pregnant women. The group of martyrs-to-be gets together to pray 2 days before they are to be killed in the arena, and miraculously, she goes into labor immediately afterwards. Felicitas' child is given to another member of the Christian community, an unnamed sister, who brings her up as her own daughter. Thus, Felicitas' motherhood identity does not disappear entirely, but it is rather transferred to another woman. Not just any woman, a woman a part of her metaphorical Christian family. Thus, just as Perpetua's connection to her son is divinely severed by God, so is Felicitas' motherhood identity. It's severed by God by allowing her to go into labor early so that she can be martyred along with the rest of her group, her martyr family. The message of this text is clear: martyrdom and motherhood are incompatible. However, the martyr Cortelosa is said to be able to be both a mother and a martyr. She does not have to give up her maternal identity because her child was a fellow Christian who had already died for his faith, just like his mother was about to. Indeed, although Cortelosa's son dies before her, his death doesn't sever their connection. He appears to her in a vision. In this vision, there's a reversal of the expected parent-child roles, and Cortelosa's son comforts her and encourages her to be strong. The absence of her husband in the vision, who, remember, died at the same time as her son, suggests that marital relation is less salient than the maternal one. And finally, Cortelosa's motherhood identity is elevated even further because she is the mother of a martyr. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. Clearly, there was a complex relationship between motherhood and martyrdom. Motherhood remained an ideal for Roman women, but for Christian women who faced martyrdom, the ideal of motherhood quickly became fraught with complications. Perpetua delays rejecting motherhood until God intervenes, while Felicitas tries to accelerate the process and then transfers her motherhood to another woman. Quartilosa is able to be both a mother and a martyr only because her son shares the martyrdom identity, and martyrdom only enhances the maternal bond between them. So the rejection of motherhood is not necessarily a prerequisite to becoming a martyr, but it only becomes necessary if failing to do so would result in the woman being unable to achieve martyrdom. We also see martyrs acting as daughters, and this is usually depicted in conflict with their parents, directly or indirectly. Perpetua's conversations with her father are the most detailed of these encounters. So throughout her narrative, Perpetua's father is depicted as trying to convince her to renounce Christianity. He appeals to her identity as daughter. He speaks of his love for her and of the anguish of Christianity and the anguish that her arrest causes him. Daughter, he said, have pity on my gray head. Have pity on your father, if I deserve to be called your father. If I have favored you above your brothers, if I have raised you to reach this prime of your life, do not abandon me to be the reproach of men. And then Perpetua is speaking. This is the way my father spoke out of love for me, kissing my hands and throwing himself down before me. With tears in his eyes, he no longer addressed me as his daughter, but as lady. And so even though she doesn't demonstrate the appropriate obedience that was expected, Perpetua nevertheless grieves over her father's pain. Eventually, her father recognizes that Perpetua's insistence on claiming this Christian identity means that she can't also be a daughter, and he stops calling her daughter and just calls her lady. Another martyr who we haven't yet talked about is depicted as rejecting her daughter identity. This martyr's name is Secunda. She's 12 years old. When upon seeing two other female martyrs pass by her in the street below her parents' home, she jumps off the balcony of the house to join them. She's depicted as loving God so much that she rejected several marriage proposals so that her focus can remain only on God. Unlike the Passion of Perpetua, however, Secunda does not engage in prolonged discussions with her parents, so in which her daughter identity is slowly removed. Rather, the other two martyrs, Maxima and Donatilla, initially doubt Secunda's commitment to martyrdom and initially identify her only as a daughter. They say, "Go away, for you are the only child of your father. To whom would you leave him?" But Secunda said, "It is better for me to defy my father according to the flesh and to love my spiritual father." Maxima and Donatilla said to her, "Consider the age of your father and do not abandon him." Secunda said, "God will repay you if you leave me." So Secunda's insistence that she needs to stay, or their insistence that Secunda needs to stay and reject the identity of martyr in favor of that of daughter is striking, particularly since this comes from two women who had themselves chosen martyrdom and presumably rejected their parents. Maxima and Donatilla's reaction is perhaps more representative of the tension within broader Christian communities regarding whether it is proper for young girls ever to reject their families, even for such a laudable goal as martyrdom. Perhaps for some of the people, the identity of daughter and its associated virtues of pietas and obedience took precedence even over martyrdom. Yet another new martyr, Salsa, is also depicted as a daughter who must eventually publicly reject her parents. However, her parents only play a minor role in her narrative as well. Despite her conversion to Christianity, they force her to accompany them to a pagan festival. There, she tries in vain to convince both her parents and the crowd of onlookers of the power of the true God. When she can't do this, she steals the head of the god statue and throws it into the sea. Then, when she tries to steal the rest of the statue, she's captured and killed by the mob before destroying the rest of it. Salsa's daughter identity does not factor into the martyrdom, as her parents completely disappear from the narrative. They do not speak out in either defense or condemnation of their daughter. Yet her identity as daughter is important to the narrative structure because it's only out of deference to them that she was at the festival in the first place. Her actions against the pagan idol may therefore be construed as a rejection of her parents and her daughter identity and the religion that they try to impose on her. And then finally, another martyr daughter or potential martyr daughter is Maria. She's briefly mentioned in a narrative of the Abytinian martyrs. Maria's father was also a Christian, and he ensured that some of his children would be martyred with them. In this case, this would allow identities of daughter and martyr to be compatible. So we have here a list from the Abytinian martyrs. It says those arrested were Saturninus and his 4 children, Saturninus Jr., Felix, the lectors, Maria, the consecrated virgin, and the child Hilarianus. Then came the presbyter Saturninus, surrounded by his numerous children. He chose some of them as companions in martyrdom. He left the others to the church as a memorial to his name. We don't know which of the 4 children he chose to come to martyrdom with him, but Maria is potentially one. She doesn't speak, and it's assumed that she agrees with her father's decision, provided or whichever way he chose. It's interesting then that the narratives of Perpetua, Secunda, and Maria focus on the relationship between daughter and father, while Perpetua's mother plays a supportive role. She is considered to likely be a Christian herself, and she goes and supports her in the jail. And Secunda and Maria's mothers are completely unmentioned. Although it's a small sample size, it might be posited that the public nature of the role identity of father affects the public way in which it features within these narratives. It's certainly clear that there's a big concern with how daughter's behavior might reflect on the father's reputations. And when the father was not a Christian, like Perpetua's father, this is depicted as reflecting of the broader concern for social order. The abandonment of pietas and the submissive agency that daughters were expected to embody might prove dangerous to the social hierarchy if it was implemented widely. More practically, the focus on fathers might be representative of the way in which the relationship between mothers and daughters is seen as occupying the domestic realm, while fathers were viewed as being responsible for the family in public. Only fathers could speak for their daughters in legal matters, for example, whether to try to convince them to change their minds, as Perpetua's father does, or to confirm their identities as martyrs, as Maria's father does. In each case, the primary relationship between the counter-identities of father and daughter clearly reflects a certain societal expectations relating to power and authority. Just as with the role identities of wife and mother, there's no single way to reject the role of daughter, and it's not always necessary. The final family identity we'll look at is the identity of sister. In general, the sisters and brothers that are referred to in martyr texts are not actual siblings. They're typically fellow Christians. So we have 2 examples that are unequivocally, clearly actual sisters, Perpetua and Victoria. So Perpetua is a sister to 3 brothers. She has 2 living brothers and 1 deceased brother. At least one of her brothers seems to be a Christian by the narrative. He joins Perpetua's mother in visiting her in prison, and it is to this brother and mother who she entrusts the care of her son. Her deceased brother has a more prominent role in the narrative, though, as Perpetua has 2 visions of him while she is imprisoned. Her brother Dinocrates had died when he was 7 years old, and in the first of these visions, she sees Dinocrates as dirty and thirsty beside a water basin, but unable to reach inside. After some prayer, she receives another vision in which Dinocrates is clean and the water basin is overflowing, and he's able to play like other children. The fact that Perpetua is shown as being able to influence Dinocrates' experience in the afterlife speaks to her power as a martyr to be, as well as to the power of the bonds between siblings. Unlike her identities of wife, mother, and daughter, Perpetua doesn't need to reject her sister identity because her living brothers are shown as supporting her, and she's able to in turn help Dinocrates in death. The acceptance or endurance of the sister identity is not universal, however, as another martyr, Victoria, must reject her brother when he tries to stop her martyrdom. This is also from the Abytinian martyrs. Victoria's brother argues that Victoria should be released because she only converted to Christianity because she was seduced by an unscrupulous Christian, a common refrain. However, Victoria rejects this characterization. She asserts, "I did everything of my own initiative and of my own free will." In this way, Victoria's arguments against her brother echo Perpetua's arguments against her father. Indeed, by speaking at trial at all, Victoria's brother acts more like a father than a brother. Thus, although this is technically an example of a sibling relationship, the dynamics are more like father-daughter. In any case, Victoria rejects her brother's claims, I should say, and therefore also rejects his claims to a family relationship or family authority over her. So from this brief overview, it's clear that women's family identities within martyr texts are multifaceted. The individual circumstances of a woman influenced much about the way in which the identities were expressed within individual narratives, as well as in the level of agency and authority that each role could be associated with. The diversity of representation of these roles is suggestive of the diversity of reality. There's no single way to be a mother. There's no single way to be a mother and a martyr. However, we should note that the connection between family roles and female martyrs continues beyond the martyr text. So for example, we can turn to Augustine. Perpetua's roles as daughter and mother are important for Augustine's understanding of her martyrdom. He is writing 100 or so, 200 years later, He makes excuses for Perpetua's disobedience for her father. He notes that it pains Perpetua to reject her father, but that she only did it out of necessity. So this is in one of his sermons. He says, what she hated in her father was his folly, not his nature, his unbelief, not her roots. Thus she earned all the greater glory by resolutely rejecting the bad advice of such a beloved father, considering that she could not see him thrashed without feeling the pain herself. So the implication here is that Christian women should not see the disobedience to their male authorities that Perpetua demonstrates as something that should be imitated. Rather, it's permissible only because of these exceptional circumstances that Perpetua was in. Her ability to overcome the weaknesses of her sex, including the family identities of wife, mother, daughter, served to make her martyrdom even more admirable, but she's the exception that proves the rule and not a new rule to be followed. In other cases, Augustine describes female martyrs as using family identities that don't appear in the martyr narrative as well. This can be seen best in the example of the martyr Crispina. So according to her martyr text, Crispina, who was martyred during the great persecution of Diocletian, and unlike some of the other examples we've looked at so far, the Passion of Crispina does not contain any narrative framework that addresses her identity before she's arrested and put on trial. So rather, the Crispina narrative is just a long dialogue between Crispina and the Roman procurator, in which he interrogates her and she continually reasserts her Christianity. So the proconsul tells her to break with this superstition and bow your head to the sacred rites of the gods of Rome. But Crispina replies, every day I worship the God Almighty. I know of no other God beside him. And Annolinus replies, you're a stubborn and insolent woman. Crispina is unusual for speaking for herself, since as we've seen with Perpetua's father and Victoria's brother, women aren't typically able to speak in legal matters, and it's usually done by a male family member. So the fact that Crispina is speaking for herself, defending herself, might suggest that Crispina doesn't have any family members with her, at least none that appear in the narrative. However, a century later, Augustine talks about Crispina in various sermons, and he calls her both a wife and a mother. In regards to her motherhood, Augustine focuses on Crispina's rejection of her children, arguing that this rejection made her martyrdom particularly praiseworthy. He also invokes Crispina as a wife in several sermons, where he needs an easy reference to a martyr who's an ideal wife, in contrast to popular virgin martyrs like Agnes or Thecla. In the context of Augustine's reference to Crispina, wife is simply the role on the opposite end of the spectrum of virgin. No further nuance or explanation is offered. So it's possible Augustine maybe has a different version of the Crispina text than we do, or he's perhaps drawing on oral traditions that maybe are filling in the gaps about who this Crispina was. But the fact that he contextualizes her using these traditional feminine roles is perfectly in line with Augustine's rhetorical emphasis elsewhere, where he talks about martyrs, that female martyrs in general should be admired for overcoming their weaknesses of their sex. And in this extant narrative, Crispina's lack of family identities makes her an outlier. By turning her into a wife and mother, Augustine makes her fit within the mold of other famous female martyrs like Perpetua. She fulfills her duties as a proper Roman woman through marriage and children, and only rejects these roles when she has to choose between committed to them or being committed to God. So Crispina gives us a clear example of the way that female martyrs are continued to be identified with their families, even when their texts don't support it. All that to say, there is far less frequency with family roles attributed to male martyrs. In the entire North African martyr literature, only 4 male martyrs are depicted in relation to their families, and sometimes the family connection comes after the martyr has died. Brief overview of these instances will show how some significant commonalities between these male martyrs. So we've already heard about the only instance of a North African male martyr being identified as a husband. This is the husband of Quartolosa. He's unnamed. He's only mentioned to contextualize Quartolosa's vision. He doesn't appear in the vision. He otherwise has no impact on the narrative. Moving on. Father. So apart from Quartolosa's husband, who is the father of her son, obviously, the only one other martyr is identified as a father. This is that presbyter Saturninus, who is said to have chosen some of his own children as companions in martyrdom, the aforementioned martyr Maria, or a potential martyr. Saturninus exercises authority traditionally expected of a father, particularly in these legal contexts. The children are assumed to show obedience. We don't hear their voices, but he literally is shown as having the power of life and death over his children. The two depictions of martyrs as sons also have a lot of parallels to each other, and the accounts might be the result of a same author, or at least a single community. They're very similar. In the first, the martyrdom of Montanus and Lucius, the martyr Flavian comforts his mother when she's upset that he was returned to the prison without being martyred. This is the result, apparently, of some misguided Christians who were advocating for his well-being, thinking that he'd be happy. He wasn't. He tells her, don't grieve over the delay, but continue to rejoice because his martyrdom will be complete soon enough. Flavian's mother is described in glowing terms. She is described as a mother of the race of the Maccabees, referring to the Jewish mother who rejoiced at the martyrdom of her 7 sons in 2nd Maccabees. The rest of the account is Flavian's martyrdom focuses on his identity as a martyr rather than a son, and his mother disappears entirely. Thus, the emphasis is more on the good mother than on the good son. So we're told here, he had at his side the mother of superior character. She wanted her son to be a martyr and was grieved with sorrow born of pride that his passion was postponed, a mother of the race of the Maccabees. Though Flavian approved of his mother's feelings, he told her, you know that it was always my effort, if it were my lot to confess to the Lord, that I might savor my martyrdom, to be seen often in chains and often remanded. If I now have received what I prayed for, we should rejoice rather than sorrow. The second martyr's son is Marion. He's only identified as a son after his death, when the audience is told that his mother rejoiced, again, like the mother of the Maccabees, embracing her son's body and kissing the wounds on his neck. Just as with Flavian, the focus is not on Marion's qualifications as a son or on their relationship, but rather on his mother's worthiness at having given birth to a martyr. The marginalization of male familial roles continues in later texts, and only one of the male martyrs is referenced by a later writer. Augustine preaches a sermon on the feast day of Marian and James, but when he discusses Marion's role as son, again, the focus is not on the admirable way that he fulfilled his duties, but on the way that his mother perfectly embodied her role. While female martyrs' family identities are invoked to help explain or enhance their remarkable achievements, male martyrs' family identities are consistently de-emphasized or completely ignored in favor of women. And so before we turn to some analysis about the deaths of these women, I want to just highlight visually the differences between the way that male martyrs and female martyrs are depicted in relation to their family roles. So I have 2 charts. This one, the first is simply based off the number of martyrs who are mentioned that fit within those roles. So for example, we discussed 4 female martyrs who are in some way or another depicted as wives. And in contrast, there's only 1 husband martyr, Quartulosa's unnamed husband, and so on. You can easily see that the number of male martyrs who are identified for their family roles is drastically less than female martyrs. But that's not the whole story. As we've seen, there's far less detail or complexity to the way that male martyrs' family identities are described. So I want to try and represent that visually as well. Here, I didn't simply count the number of people mentioned as a wife or husband, etc. I tried to account for the complexity of these identities. So for example, martyrs who had multiple interactions with their family members get multiple points on the graph. So Perpetua is identified as a daughter. She has 3 separate interactions with her father, so she gets 4 points. I dealt with Crispina a little bit differently by assigning her half a point as a wife and half a point for mother, since they don't appear in her martyr narrative, but they are mentioned later. So it's not a perfect system, but it does kind of more accurately reflect the discrepancies between the way that genders are depicted in relation to their families. It's not just that women are depicted as having families more often, but it's also that their family roles are much more detailed. The level of engagement fills a far greater amount of narrative space than their male counterparts. It's not the case in just 1 or 2 martyrdom narratives, but it's a pattern across North African martyr literature. Whenever families are mentioned, the focus remains on the women. There are several interesting differences between the way that male and female martyrs are depicted in relation to their family identities. So for example, the male martyrs that we see have supportive families, which necessarily impacts the way that they are depicted. They don't have conflict with their mothers who are on the same side as them. So within martyrdom text, the roles of father, son, and husband are very much 2-dimensional tropes that provide little, if any, additional information about the martyrs or the way that their deaths were interpreted in the community. And even when men are identified by their family roles, the focus remains on the female counter roles, as we've seen. While Perpetua can be a wife with a missing husband, Secunda and Salsa could be daughters without parents, none of the men are identified with family roles without the presence of their female counterparts. The closest to this would maybe be Saturninus, whose daughter doesn't speak, but she's there. She has a name and a distinguishing detail. She's a consecrated virgin. Men's female roles are really then about women. Men's family roles then are really about women. Men's family identities are marginalized, but women's family identities are central, and they endure even after death. It's also important to remember that the fact that it doesn't show up in the literature shouldn't imply that men with families didn't become martyrs as much as women with families did. We do have a couple examples from Rome of men who have to reject their families. And so we should expect that men too did have to reject their families at some point. We can think of Jesus's command to his disciples and to reject their families in Matthew and Luke, or of Tertullian's description of relatives of all martyrs as potential, quote, hindrances to the soul. However, this action of rejection does not form part of the narrative arcs of the North African male martyrs, where once again, mentions of the family focus only on women. Oh, sorry, I should have. Okay. Before we explore the reasons why this might be the case, I want to turn briefly to gendered punishments. Martyrs are typically executed in a very public manner. This is to act as a deterrent to others and also as part of the entertainment of gladiator shows where other criminals were executed as part of that. Romans tended to like themed punishments, and so this included connections to gender. You could use female animals for female victims, for example. You could dress up victims in costumes related to Roman myth or history. For women victims, they found it particularly dramatic to juxtapose women in feminine dress or completely nude with the violence that was about to be inflicted on their bodies. In the Perpetua narrative, two women, Perpetua and Felicitas, are brought into the arena covered only in nets. This is a shocking display to the crowd, particularly because their bodies are explicitly coded as feminine. We're told even the crowd was horrified when they saw that one was a delicate young girl and the other was a woman fresh from childbirth with milk still dripping from her breasts. And so they were brought back again and dressed in unbelted tunics. So here it's interesting that Perpetua's family identities are totally gone. She's not a respectable matron of 22 at the beginning of her narrative, but instead she's a young girl here. She has no other qualifiers. But despite her rejection of motherhood for Felicitas, this identity remains etched on her body for everyone to see. The officials then send a heifer against Perpetua. Once again, her gender is emphasized both by the animal attacking her and by the way she responds. We're told first the heifer tossed Perpetua and she fell on her back. Then sitting up, she pulled down the tunic that was ripped along the side so that it covered her thighs, thinking more of her modesty than her pain. Next, she asked for a pin to fasten her untidy hair, for it was not right that a martyr should die with her hair in disorder, lest she might seem to be mourning in her hour of triumph. Here, Perpetua is once again taking the role of a Roman matron, concerned about public modesty, even under this extreme duress. Since Roman women didn't appear in public with their hair undone except during funerals and mourning rituals, Perpetua is shown as adhering to these social norms as well. It's worth a reminder that this part of the narrative is written by the redactor, who is likely male, and who is shaping this narrative to provide the greatest amount of sympathy toward Perpetua and the other martyrs. Nevertheless, in this moment, while Perpetua's femininity is highlighted, her family identities still remain firmly in view. And finally, Perpetua's death. Perpetua has agency in taking her own death. We're told that she took the trembling hand of the young gladiator and guided it to her throat. It was as though so great a woman, fearing as she was by the unclean spirit, could not be dispatched unless she herself was willing. The final view of Perpetua is of a woman taking the ultimate control in determining when and how her life ends. In the ancient world, the choice for self-killing is seen as noble, but Perpetua's action of grabbing the sword and participating in her own penetration nevertheless has gendered undercurrents. Thus, at this moment of death, Perpetua is at once masculine and feminine. Ultimately, she's completely alone. She's not a mother, a daughter, a wife, or a sister in this final moment. So let's go back and think about the way that family identities are conflated with gender. First, although martyr texts do have some examples of gender bending, the distinct discrepancy between female family imagery for men and family imagery for women highlights the literary appeal of the ideal of a rigid division between public male, private female. In these texts, women must transcend the private in order to engage in the public/masculine death of a martyr, and this means rejecting or reconfiguring at least the family. Men are already operating in this public sphere with or without a family, so this act of rejection is perhaps not necessarily worth portraying in the literature. Furthermore, it's not just martyrdom texts in which men's family roles are downplayed or diminished. Men's family lives are rarely discussed in ancient literature in any context, and certainly not to the extent that women's family roles are analyzed, scrutinized, and regulated. Indeed, despite the ideal of a good marriage, the role of husband is not generally seen to be of great significance. There are only a few ancient references to husband in comparison to vast corpuses of discussion about wives and handbooks about being a good wife. This continues in the context of late antique Christianity, in which very few accounts of real marriages exist. More often, the focus is on husband or wives who either want to avoid marriage in favor of celibacy or to maintain a celibate state within a marriage. Christian martyr texts follow this pattern, also focusing on women's behavior within the marriage and family and on men's behavior outside of it. Neither marriage nor family were connected with the ideals of masculine success. Family roles were not tied to men's masculinity in the same way that women's femininity is closely entwined with their roles of wives, mother, and daughter. Therefore, men's rejection of their families does not signify a kind of shift in identity like it does for women. Shedding family identities allowed women to become masculinized, which was necessary to achieve perfection before God. For men, this perfection is already there. Because of their close connection to their family roles, it's far more drastic for a woman to renounce marriage and children than it is for men. The rejection or reconfiguration of these identities is central to the journey of female martyrs, but there's no parallel step that's necessary for men. And finally, even when men are shown as giving up their feminine roles, their deaths are still gendered. It is rhetorically powerful to juxtapose violence with perceived feminine weaknesses, and women who overcome these weaknesses could be celebrated even more. There was tension between women's words and actions and the way that their bodies were used in symbols by the authors of the texts that eventually commemorate them. So ultimately, we've seen that men can be martyrs regardless of whether their family supported them or not, but women rarely escape identification by their gender or their family identities. Whether rejecting non-Christian family members, being martyrs alongside Christian ones, or supporting male martyrs, women's roles in martyr texts are consistently depicted in relation to men. So for women, martyrdom was always a family affair. Thank you.